we will get going, and anyone else who joins, I will try and do that while I speak. Thank you so much for joining, and welcome to the inaugural Supply Chain Risk in the Spotlight event. So my name is Ashley Mitchell. I am the Head of Growth and Marketing at Risk Ledger, and I'm really pleased you've joined, both registered and turned up this morning, because there was a real distinct possibility that this could have looked like a Risk Ledger team meeting, because it is our first event. And actually, given that we're a year into the pandemic and working from home, it seems a bit strange that this is our first virtual event. But the reason why we've avoided doing an event until now is because we only wanted to take up people's time when we really had something to say. You know, we don't want to just be on here talking about the Risk Ledger platform, even though it is very great and we'd love for you to learn more about it. We really believe that, you know, if you're taking your time, we want to give you some real value. So I'm just going to run through a little bit about what we're going to do here today, and then we'll kick proceedings off. Like I said earlier, if anybody has any issues, please do message me on the chat and I'll try and get that sorted for you. So the catalyst for this event series is the fact that we hit 500 suppliers on the Risk Ledger platform, literally on New Year's Eve of 2020. And that gave us the critical mass of suppliers and assessment data to be able to uncover some really useful insights that we want to share with you, and we've been sharing in the reports that hopefully some of you have seen. So in the last 2 months, we have used sort of the anonymized and aggregated data from the platform to turn these into useful insights, particularly for people who are third-party risk managers and having to try and manage the security risks in the supply chain. So that's a brief introduction into what we're doing here. And so I'll just quickly run you through the agenda for the event. To start us off, I'm going to play a short video that actually looks back at the insights that were covered in the reports that we've published in the last few months. So that's our data protection risks in the supply chain report, and then the security governance insight report, which was actually just published this week. Hopefully you've been able to have a quick look at them, but this video will give you a flavor of what those insights involve so that you can take part in the discussion afterwards. So after that, we've then really lucky to be joined by a panel of supply chain security experts. So I'm delighted to say, and he's actually just jumped in as well, we'll be having Ben Dickinson, Managing Director at 3VRM. So they're a specialist third-party risk management consultancy. Also on the panel, we'll have Rob Newby, who's a highly experienced cyber security executive and the founder of Procordr. And then last but not least, we'll have our own CEO, Haydn Brooks, fresh from yesterday's panel at the SASIG event, which was actually really good, and I can see that some of you were at that event as well. So hopefully we can live up to those standards. Thank you for all our guests for joining. Really appreciate it. As I said, it is our first one. And then finally, after that panel, we'll have hopefully a really spirited question and answer session where we don't just want the panel to speak. It would be great to get some thoughts of those of you who've joined us today. So I think we're ready to start. The flow of people joining has slowed down. So I'm just going to get the video ready. And while I do that, I'm just going to put a poll on screen. And this is so that I can learn a little bit more about who's with us and the challenges that you guys are facing with third-party risk management. So bear with me. First poll, first event. Let's see if this works. For those of you watching on the on-demand webinar, you should now be able to see the poll questions on screen. And in a moment, I'll also show you the results that we got from our audience at the time. What we find interesting about these results is the broad variety of challenges third-party risk managers are facing, and that none of the traditional solutions have been good enough to become widely adopted. So I'm going to stop showing the results and share my screen for the introductory video. This video is designed to give you a tour through the supply chain security risk insights published in our recent insight reports, looking at data protection risks in the supply chain published in February and security governance risks in the supply chain published this week in March. This event is not a sales pitch, but it is important to understand a little bit about how the Risk Ledger platform works so you can understand the data we've used to uncover these insights. The Risk Ledger platform allows organizations to run a comprehensive, security-led third-party risk management program while allowing suppliers to complete and maintain a single risk profile which they can share with any client who wants to conduct due diligence against them. The supplier risk profile is formed by the 12 risk domains in our standardized supplier assessment framework, which has been refined with the support of the National Cybersecurity Center. Each risk domain contains a number of control-based questions that suppliers answer and evidence. We've used the aggregated and anonymized data from nearly 750 suppliers with complete risk profiles on the Risk Ledger platform and drawn insights from what we've found to share with you. Let's start with data protection. Data protection in the supply chain has risen in significance because of sweeping regulations that put the onus on firms to do more than ever to ensure their third parties manage and secure data shared with them. The GDPR and the CCPA both set specific supply chain requirements, and the European Court of Justice's ruling that the EU-US Privacy Shield was invalid has almost put an end to the free flow of data between the two economic giants, causing havoc for data supply chains. We found that while 5% of suppliers had suffered a data breach in the past 6 months, 14% don't maintain a log of data breaches involving personal data. Following the tried and tested security policy, if it isn't on paper, it didn't happen. At this point, it is worth noting that if a supplier has been asked by a client to complete this set of controls, it is because the product or service they deliver brings data protection regulations into scope, however much they plead that they're a small company or only handle small amounts of data. So we can't discount these small percentages by assuming they are micro suppliers manufacturing widgets who can cause no harm. The implementation of the GDPR is likely to have pushed many organizations to develop, or at least edit a template, data protection policy, but a full 19% of organizations still don't have a nominated data protection officer as defined by the GDPR. Worryingly, 20% of organizations reported that they don't conduct data protection impact assessments as part of their risk assessment process, and we found that the rate of suppliers who have suffered a security breach that led to the loss of personal data in the last 6 months was 40% higher among this group compared to the percentage for the whole group. Interestingly, the issue of visibility into supply chain risks beyond third parties is something we hope to be able to show more of in the future insight reports as our network grows, because we have the unique ability to map compliance with your supply chain risk policies by 4th, 5th, and 6th parties. We found that among the cohort of suppliers who have a Cyber Essentials certification, 8% of them had suffered a security breach that led to the loss of personal data in the last 6 months, compared to 5% across the whole group. It is hard to pinpoint the reason for this. Perhaps complacency by organizations who go through certification, but it is clear across a number of controls that Cyber Essentials cannot be used as a way to mitigate supply chain security risks in a meaningful way. Some insights highlighted a total lack of regard for data protection risk management, or more likely, a total lack of understanding. 10% of suppliers who transfer personal data outside of the UK and the EEA don't conduct data protection impact assessments. In the report, you will find links to 2 cases where organizations have been fined using the GDPR because of third-party data breaches. The roundup of this report was that the data pointed towards a small but consistent cohort of organizations who have poor data protection risk controls in place and are putting their clients at risk of hefty fines and third-party breaches. On to security governance. We trebled the size of this report compared to the data protection edition because we felt there was a lot to say about this risk domain. The setting of policies, processes, responsibilities, and structures is foundational to cyber resilience in the supply chain, so do have a read to benefit from the examples and the cross-control insights. 1 in 10 organizations don't have an appointed person responsible for information security, and they don't conduct an annual independent information security review. We think that this insight alone captures the challenge for third-party risk managers. This means that 10% of organizations do not have a good understanding of the security risks they face as an organization and would most likely be the last to know if they were actually breached, maybe second to last, just before their clients. Staggeringly, we found that 1 year into the pandemic, 19% of organizations don't have a remote working policy. 9% of organizations don't have a documented information security or cybersecurity policy. And in the case that one of these organizations are hit by the increasing number of ransomware attacks, we found that nearly 1 in 5 organizations don't have a documented backup policy. Cloud computing has become a significant factor, and in many organizations, more systems and data are now in the cloud than on premises, but an incredible 40% of organizations don't have a policy governing the use of cloud services. It is perhaps unsurprising that 9% of organizations have neither an information security policy nor a cloud computing policy. The final insight I want to share with you is the fact that 8% of organizations don't technically enforce a password policy across their IT estate and don't have a documented access control policy. So if the weak password protection wasn't enough to invite bad actors, the freedom to access multiple systems with stolen admin credentials surely is. Excellent. Thanks very much for joining. So we've looked back at the insights that we covered in the last 2 reports, and between the 3 of you, you've all got different perspectives on how to manage supply chain risk. So it would be interesting to just go around at the start and put those insights that we've just seen into a real world context for people who have sort of joined the event as third-party risk managers and want to know what they should be doing next with this information. Shall we start with you, Rob?
Yeah, sure. No, morning. Hi. Yeah, I'm Rob Newby. I'm the CEO of Procordr. I'm also an advisory board member at Risk Ledger. So the first thing that hit me when I was reading through the report is that you talk about third party and supply chain almost interchangeably. And there is a small but fairly important difference. So third party it feels to me like that's kind of old school. Third party is you touch the nearest thing to you. You go and do as much as you can with your immediate supply chain. But supply chain, as you were just saying, is your third, your fourth, fifth. It goes a long way back. And we've recently just seen the outcomes of that complex supply chain with the whole SolarWinds and now Microsoft and multiple government departments being compromised because of it. The other thing that struck me about that whole SolarWinds situation is that I'm not sure any very stringent supply chain risk management would have stopped it, but then that's not what the point is. It's risk management, it's not incident response. It's a contractual device a lot of the time, and it sets the scope of contractual responsibility. And we don't get to do that a lot of the time with big players like Microsoft and the AWS, these guys. So there's a lot of complexity out there in the supply chain. It's very difficult to apply a one-size-fits-all to it. And at the moment, everybody's using spreadsheets, and it's a complete mess. As with the rest of security, I might add. We're using spreadsheets for controls, we're using it for risks, we're using it for supply chain, we're using it for everything else pretty much. And we have this massive data, and we can't ever visualize it. And that's actually where I got the idea for what I'm doing now, Procordr, through talking to Haydn right at the beginning of what I was doing. And I was actually looking at Risk Ledger, and I was thinking, well, there's more data out there than we know what to do with. How do we visualize it? And he's gone and taken that off in a very different direction. which I'm sure you'll be showing us a bit more of.
Thanks so much, Rob. So let me play devil's advocate. You mentioned that there's so much complexity and a one size fits all doesn't work. Let me hand over to Haydn Brooks, our CEO, who has built Risk Ledger and is looking to put a model at least out there that most organizations can follow. How can you put those insights into context for us, Haydn?
Yeah, so I think the thing that strikes me the most is that when we look at kind of the data protection report, a lot of the clients that were onboarding suppliers pre the report coming out already had a process in place to be checking things like the controls that the report covers. And so the report's kind of highlighted that the programs previously weren't effective in actually being able to identify where suppliers weren't fulfilling requirements around data protection. And not only that, the platform then basically helped them solve those gaps as well. And as Rob said, like the supply chain basically is just infinitely complex. And as you kind of uncover more suppliers, you uncover kind of deeper problems underneath them as well. And so yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of third-party risk managers being able to identify and rectify gaps, particularly in the data protection side of things, which is one of the more interesting domains in security because it tends to be the one that has the least amount of subjective opinion when it comes to it. It's kind of like if a supplier runs a DPIA process or doesn't, it tends to be fairly black or white as to whether or not they're compliant. And in terms of one size fits all, so yeah, that's something that we identified very early on with our platform, and the way kind of the platform tries to account for that is that we have a set of questions that basically scope each assessment to the supplier. And so in that way, we tend to focus down on the things that are important for that supplier, given the services they provide. And the platform pretty much automates that from the get-go, which is quite nice.
So Ben, you run a specialist consultancy that actually supports clients to do this. So you know, our audience are effectively probably very similar to your client base, like it is us at Risk Ledger, who are coming to you with these challenges, with insights like we've just seen and that we've seen in the reports. What do you help them to do next?
Well, a variety of things. Given the sort of complexity we talked about, we get involved in all sorts of work, from helping organizations design an approach to a framework, adopt a platform like Risk Ledger, or then go do specific, more technical components like actually test whether controls are operating for certain suppliers. And I guess a few things that sort of struck me, as well as the general messages in the report, I think are consistent with what we see across our client base, that when you begin to understand your supply base and begin to probe and ask questions, you do unearth more risk. And you know, a couple of things that struck me, that the fact that you know 20% of organizations aren't doing DPIAs and 40% don't have an approach to cloud, when most of the world is migrating their environment to cloud, or their suppliers certainly are, is probably quite a concern. And I guess the other thing that struck me is that the responses, you're mining for sort of governance and policy, and is the organization set up in the right way? A lot of the work we do then goes beyond into the next level and begins to test and validate, and if they have a policy in place, is that operating? And again, you begin to get, it's like layers of an onion. Some organizations are very good, and you know, in the absence of a policy, they might be operating controls, but a lot aren't. And so what might look good on the surface, if they have a policy or a process in place, you begin to actually ask them to demonstrate or observe that a particular control is operating, and it's a very different story. So I guess to go back to your opening question, we sort of help organizations, A, understand who their key suppliers are, B, we try and work with them to pinpoint a sensible way to understand and assess those risks. And there's a combination of tools and techniques we can use to do that.
Thanks, Ben. And we touched on a couple of things that are interesting then, but all of you have mentioned sort of taking these insights and then doing the next step. But that assumes that most third-party risk managers have this type of data. And actually what we've seen, and it's actually the reason for, you know, Risk Ledger's being, it's the reason for FreeVR being there, is many organizations don't actually have access to this data. And to touch on something that Ben just said, many organizations aren't even sure who their vendors are and what their vendors do for them. So it would be really interesting to hear from all of your perspectives and experience about the challenges organizations face to get access to this kind of sort of supply chain risk data. Why don't we kick off with Haydn, since this is the wheelhouse of Risk Ledger.
Yeah, so I suppose the first big challenge that we find with pretty much every client we speak to is capacity. So it tends to be they have a lot of suppliers and they don't have a huge amount of resource internally to be able to throw manual programs at the suppliers and collect this data at scale. And that's kind of the first problem that we focused on trying to solve with the platform. And as kind of a tangent to that problem, what we tend to find is that clients will quite rightly triage their suppliers, but then they will only ever run reviews over, let's say, the top 10 or 20, and they'll then repeat those reviews yearly. And what you tend to find is your top 10 or 20 suppliers tends to be the same suppliers across kind of, you go speak to any client, it tends to be the same kind of 10 suppliers at the top of their list, depending slightly on sector. And so you tend to find that it's the same suppliers getting all of these reviews kind of over and over and over. And a lot of the smaller, what are deemed as less critical suppliers who actually do still pose quite a large risk to the organization are the ones where you end up missing quite a few of the controls that they should have implemented in essence, and where a lot of companies get caught out. So yeah, the first problem that our clients or the clients that we speak to end up experiencing is being able to run these programs at scale. And then the second is essentially being able to collect the data and analyze it in some sort of meaningful way that leads to action out of the end of it. So it's all well and good collecting kind of 100 spreadsheets worth of data and kind of reviewing it and having it sit there. But then the ability to be able to go out and track action to try and remediate and close some of these gaps, and even to educate your suppliers on what they should be doing is really quite critical to the success of your third-party risk management program. And that's where a platform like ours kind of can step in and help.
Ben, you touched on the fact that beyond the data collection piece, there is there's an additional piece to validate some of that information and go into. Can you talk through that process as well? Because for some on the event, they might be more familiar with or think that heading into an office to back up the data that somebody's collected with Risk Ledger is what they need to do for some of their most critical suppliers.
Yeah. So I'll come back to that if that's all right. So just to build on what Haydn was saying, your question about how do organisations get their arms around suppliers? It's probably that remains one of the biggest challenges that all our clients and even organisations that are very mature. It is a difficult thing to get your arms around. Certainly organisations of any scale. And just some sort of practical, the way we approach it, and to build on what sort of Haydn was saying is. For organisations that haven't started that journey or are just getting their arms around it, number one, always go and speak to your finance team and get a list of who you're spending money with and start there. There's your source report to understand who your key suppliers are. If you run that for 12 months. Then also go and talk to your technology team who is physically connecting to your network right now, because they'll have a very different list of who you're spending money with. And then if there's a separate group, again, in charge of your cloud services, which may or may not exist in some organizations, it may be part of the network team, but they should have an inventory of the cloud services they're taking. And then the final element, which is the supply chain one that Rob was sort of shining a light on earlier and Haydn was touching on, where Risk Ledger might be able to help ultimately. Fourth parties and end parties, the ones that sit behind the entities you're paying immediately, is where a lot of risk and where a lot of risk events have been occurring. And that's where a little bit of manual analysis is often required at the moment, because there's an absence of tools that ultimately shine a light on who those key fourth parties are. So if you get those three sources first and then begin to work proactively with those suppliers and quite frankly, just question them and mind for who their material sort of subcontractors are, that is the best way of piecing together that sort of initial estate. But that as it might sound, for some organisations, they will have done a chunk of that already. For others, it will be quite a bit of journey just to get their arms around that. Moving on then, the sort of next step is classically, that's going to be a large number for most organisations. How do you triage that and quickly prioritise the ones that you care about and want to do something with? And again, we help organisations, we call it segmentation or tiering. It can be an inherent risk assessment. And Haydn's got a sort of neat way in Risk Ledger of trying to solve for that, just 4 key filtering questions to quickly surface the suppliers you potentially want to have an intervention or engagement with. But again, there's various different ways and different levels of complexity you can introduce that. And I guess the more quality you can get at that triage stage, the more pointed and targeted you can be about how you deploy your efforts to then risk assess. And to go back to the question you did ask, there was method in the madness. How do you then, for the ones that you surface as actually, you know, they do matter to you, they are processing large volumes of personal data potentially, or access to super sensitive corporate information, they're hosting critical services, or they're interacting with your customers, they're the ones where you do really want to understand their control environment. Because if they've got high value of assets of yours, you want to know whether or not they're vulnerable, whether there's any threats to those assets. And that's where the whole questionnaire sort of control validation process kicks in, and where Risk Ledger is trying to enable organizations to get access to the best quality data as efficiently as possible. When you've got that data back from the suppliers, then that's when you might want to go to the next level of testing or validation, which is often a lot of work we do, which is a supplier has come back and say that they are patching, for example, but are they really patching? We want to actually see, have they pulled the latest updates from Microsoft, and let's see how they've been distributed on their environment. And we get them to either walk through or demonstrate to us that the key controls that they're operating are really in place. And the interesting thing for us, and again, why Haydn and the direction Risk Ledger is going in is a particular interest. We are thinking of ways about how can we get that information on a more automated basis? How can we raise the transparency on suppliers' controls? Because that's good for them, and it's good for the ecosystem if we can achieve that.
Thanks, Ben. And Rob, you spent a lot of time sort of advising senior cybersecurity leaders, or being in the position yourself. So you've had to face this challenge as the client, so to speak. Can you talk about some of your experiences there?
Yeah, I would agree with both of those. Capacity is always a problem. Doesn't matter what area of the security department you're in. But I actually wrote down complexity, which is what Ben was talking about, as being the biggest issue for me. And what you find out very quickly in supply chain is that there are three main areas that are involved with it. You've got InfoSec, you've got data protection or legal. You know, that tends to be in the legal department in the larger enterprises. And then you've got procurement. And those, the kind of three legs of the stool, will always be at odds with each other in some way. And it's because InfoSec tends to be the one which takes the longest in analysis, because we love having all of the data at our fingertips, right? We want to know more. And that annoys the data protection guys, because they don't want us to have all the data. And it slows down procurement, so it annoys them, and everyone's pointing at InfoSec. So the whole thing gets slowed down by InfoSec. So it was always, you know, we were always having fingers pointed at us, but we were always trying to point out that's where your high risks are. And where your high risks are is not always where your high value contracts are. And that's something that sometimes takes a bit of getting your head around. So you could be spending, a minute amount, less than 20,000, and that then passes some procurement threshold, passes under a procurement threshold, which means it could just be missed completely. They don't want us to do anything on it, by which time that's gone into our projects somewhere, someone's deployed it, there's now a piece of software on our network, and we've picked it up at the end of a project, typically, where someone's gone, oh, can I just check? It's usually a project manager or an IT guy who's gone, I'm not sure how safe this is. Can somebody from InfoSec have a look? By which point it's been bought, we've signed a contract, we've had it deployed, we've got infrastructure built, we've got software built around it, it's integral to the way that things work, and we're saying, no, you can't do that. And it's like, well, do something about it then. And InfoSec, again, the ones getting the fingers pointed at them, which is not the way to do it. So that triage piece is massively important. And so I'm repeating what Ben said, but I'm emphasizing what he said. Get that triage right, and don't be swayed by what your data protection people and what your procurement people are saying. It's not their process. They've got their parts of the process, and this is what Risk Ledger will do really nicely for you. It cuts out their bits of the process and detaches and decouples them from the InfoSec process. So you can define your InfoSec process without holding any of that up. let that go through. You go and do the infosec process at your pace. You can actually usually do it quicker because you haven't got to wait for their replies. You just go and do what you need to do directly with the customer and put your remediation plans in place, get all of that back. Yep, everything's fine, tick, on you go. So it speeds the whole thing up, and that complexity is what creates the drag in infosec, and that's what increases cost as well. So everything when you get to a management level comes down to cost, and that comes from people and complexity usually.
Haydn, I want to cover look at two things that Rob just mentioned. The different stakeholders who are interested in the first-party risk management process. So we've got procurement there, infosec, and others. And you've spoken before about how the risk ledger platform actually helps people to work together. So Rob talked about the platform unblocking some of those sort of blockers that are there in traditional systems. Can you talk about maybe even with some anecdotal evidence of existing risk ledger clients about how they've been able to work together to get this process faster and more effective?
Yeah, just linked to that. So in a previous job I had, I worked for one of the big four consultancies, and they released a report that was focused on third-party risk management, looking at collaboration. This is going back 4 or 5 years, and that's both collaboration with your suppliers. You tend to find that when you kind of approach these reviews with your suppliers in a collaborative way, the suppliers don't actually want to be insecure, so they're quite willing to learn and improve based on the outputs of the reviews. But equally as well, it's collaboration internally within your own enterprise. So like Rob said, I've worked with many teams where procurement, security, data protection, legal are all kind of at odds with each other. And it tends to be because they don't have visibility over what each team is doing. They don't really have visibility over the reasons why each team has to do what they do. And so because of that, you end up with a lot of friction kind of between the handoffs between the teams, and with a lot of teams getting frustrated, typically because another team's slowing down their KPIs or whatever it might be. And yeah, that's where kind of increased collaboration and visibility between these teams tends to play a key role. So we always recommend that when you're implementing a third-party risk management program, that it does involve procurement, security, compliance, and as many different teams as required to make sure that it does run smoothly. And we'd also recommend that you get some sort of executive kind of buy-in for that as well, because it tends to be quite a costly program that can uncover a lot of risk. And so if you don't have that buy-in, you tend to lose steam on the program very quickly. And then alongside that, trying to find ways in which you can increase collaboration between these teams and can increase the way that these teams work together is always kind of beneficial to the smooth operation of that program of work. And the way the platform does that is essentially by allowing all of the teams to kind of collaborate together within one workflow and within one kind of dashboard, so they can all see what's going on and what the status is of each supplier with each team. The other thing I'll jump in quickly and say as well is the segmentation that we see at clients. So we tend to find that segmentation, when used correctly, tends to lead to you focusing in on different areas of risk depending on the supplier. But we do come across a lot of cases where segmentation is used purely as a way for you to justify not reviewing more of your supply chain. It's almost used as a capacity management type check before the program. I just wanted to kind of a little story. I worked on a breach a couple of years ago where a paper supplier, somebody who was really not that critical, had a really low spend, no access to systems or data, ended up being breached by a malicious actor who got into their email service and managed to send an email through into a client at the time. And it went straight through all of their email controls. It was a legitimate email from kind of a trusted server, but full of malware. And it's kind of cases like that where you start to realize actually just how complex some of these kind of segmentation activities are.
That's a really good example. You've both touched on cost. Now, Ben, we know that cost and the scale of a third-party risk management program are working in opposite directions, and so many people on the event will be trying to work out where do they find the happy medium between a really expensive program that tries to cover tick all boxes and overturn all stones, or how should they try and make that calculation, and how do you advise them to do that?
Oh, I'm not going to answer the first question. I have no idea, but I'll have a stab at the second. I think the business case for investing in third-party risk is quite like any operational risk topic. It is a difficult one to quantify sometimes, and I have seen organisations really struggle with this. There are ways that you can try and break it down and quantify what do you think is the value at risk, and therefore what is going to be the cost to implement, you know, a third-party framework and the activities, and maybe invest in tooling. But like any calculation, it's highly subjective. It's highly subjective. I think where we've seen clients probably achieve higher levels of maturity on this topic, they're almost always the ones that have experienced a major risk event. And I guess, unfortunately for them, but maybe fortunately for us, that trend seems to be increasing. Particularly on topics of cyber and resilience. You know, we are seeing more organisations, more events publicly reported, and there's a lot more definitely being worked on privately. So, and the organisations that have experienced a risk event in the supply chain do tend to invest quite heavily. They're the organisations with big teams, with, you know, large assurance programs, very sophisticated triaging activity, big contracting departments, and they've probably invested quite a lot in technology. And I guess my advice to organisations that haven't had that risk event is the fact that that is often the response when they have one probably gives you a scale or an indicator of how painful it is when it occurs. And it's not just the sort of size of the potential fine from the regulator, but it's the cost of all the activity that goes on behind the scenes to get the regulator in a good place that is hidden and isn't sort of reported. But those are quite substantial. And what often happens in those scenarios is when organisations begin to engage with their supply chain and really start, you know, assessing the risk, that they unearth things that are really uncomfortable. And it becomes a little bit of not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the more they begin to engage and explore, the more they want to know, for very good reasons. I mean, most organisations, you know, have a huge proportion of their activities and operations now being done by their supply chain. In terms of, to go to your question, how do you sort of, what would my advice be? I think number one, do try and quantify what the organisation is really concerned about. And again, this will vary quite significantly depending on the volumes of suppliers you've got and what they're actually doing for you. I think that when you've got clear what that sort of potential exposure looks like, then you can consider, well, how much do we want to spend on actually litigating this? And the final thing I would probably mention is that where we do see organisations have invested in this topic, to the points Haydn was making, that we do see a lot of duplication and overlaps. Most organisations we go into have opportunities for improvement. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a net investment to achieve those opportunities. In lots of cases, it can just be the smart consolidation of activities or execution of them through some enabling technology or partners. So, for example, the classic scenario you've got where you have a privacy team, a security function and procurement going off with different inventories of suppliers, engaging at different points, doing it either on spreadsheets or different tools. And we see all of the above playing out right now, by the way. If that was consolidated and centralized, there would be a net saving and it would be more efficient. And that saving could either be banked or actually invested in doing something more valuable or insightful in terms of risk mitigation. But yeah, if that answers the question.
That's a really comprehensive answer. And Haydn, I know you're itching to get in on that one.
Just to add a point onto the end there, that what you also tend to find is the more efficient you make the program, the higher the quality of the data you get back tends to be from the supplier. Because if you're putting the supplier through kind of 5 or 6 different processes and kind of catch them out the blue every month with a brand new set of questions, you tend to find they disengage very quickly. And so trying to make your program as efficient as possible to lead to a better and more effective program as well in terms of the data and actions that you can launch off the back of that.
I definitely want to come back to you on the cost question, Haydn, but Rob, I want you to talk our audience through how within an organization, if you want to ramp up your third-party risk management program, say from a very manual spreadsheet-based or maybe non-existent program, how should they go about building that business case within the organization, building support from the other stakeholders as somebody who's been advising on that. Yeah.
That's exactly the point I was going to make, was the cost doesn't always just come with scale. The cost comes, the cost comes at both ends of the scale. So if you want to introduce a third-party risk management program to an organization that doesn't have one, they're already experiencing cost. It just won't be as visible to them. So and the way to do that is, Ben talked about value at risk, but he also said it's very difficult to quantify. And essentially what you're then doing is the old salesman trick of, a bit of fear, uncertainty and doubt. But when you have no data, that is what you end up using. You have to go and say to your board or your exco, this is the problem. Look what happened to the guy next door, and if you relate it to someone else in your own sector who's had that problem, that suddenly becomes a very real threat. And you can then, don't think of it as FUD, think of it as quantification, because if you can point to a similar sized company in a similar sector having had a threat that that you have vulnerabilities for, you can say, well, this could happen to us. This is the kind of loss that we could be facing. So let me take a percentage of that cost to actually build something that's going to mitigate that. And I mean, that's always been the way for me to build anything pretty much from scratch. A lot of the work that I've done over the last 10 years particularly has been transformation programs, starting with very little and building it into something more. So you have to have a comparator to start with, and whether that's showing that the maturity across your estate is not good, or whether it's showing that actually people in the position that we're in, this exact position, have had these problems and it's cost them X. Monetary figures are always compelling for people who are trying to operate a company, because it hits their bottom line. But yeah, so I would say where you've got the small teams, the problem is that they won't want to be adding more people, because if you think about it, in a team of, I'm used to running teams of 30 plus. So in a team of 30, if I add one more person, it's not going to be a massive uplift in my cost. If I've got a team of 5, if I add one more person to run third-party risk management, that's quite a big increase. You've got 20% more cash that you've got to find as an operating expense there, and that is very hard to justify. But if you have a small capex cost that says that we spend this once and that takes care of our third-party risk management, and then we add a little sliver of cost to somebody existing in their role, that's a much easier thing to justify.
That takes us quite nicely to Haydn. So I said I wanted to come back to you on cost, because one of the key value propositions of the Risk Ledger platform is that ability for an organization to run quite a comprehensive third-party risk management program through the platform. So can you talk to us about how, or what, first of all, why you thought that was really important in the founding of Risk Ledger, and then how you've seen that in action as you go to organizations who are struggling, basically in the situation Rod's just spoken about, with smallish teams, very tight on resources for the security team, but still want to run a decent third-party risk management program.
Yeah, happy to. So again, in a previous role, when I came up with the idea for Risk Ledger, I was working on a program of work for a bank where we were charging £20,000 per supplier review that we were doing. And it occurred to me very quickly that kind of reducing the cost per supplier and the amount of time spent per supplier review is something that's quite critical to enabling these programs to be a lot more effective in a way. And the reason for that was essentially that because of the high costs, the clients that we were speaking to could really only cover kind of 3 to 5% of their supply chain with their program. And they tended then to just review the same suppliers year on year. And then because of that, they kept experiencing incidents from kind of the middle or lower portions of the supply chain that they weren't able to cover due to capacity and cost. So the first the first thing that we wanted to solve with third-party risk management was it's building a platform that enabled that cost per supply to be reduced to an amount that would allow you to cover more of your supply chain in a much more efficient way, and at the same time allow smaller organizations to start adopting this process. Because another thing that occurred to me was that a lot of the big clients that we would help run this process with, they would ask their suppliers to run a process over their own supply chain. And it was rare that I ever come across a supplier that was running any meaningful third-party risk management process over their own suppliers, especially if they were an SME or under kind of 200 people. So the reason for kind of increasing the efficiency and reducing that cost per supplier was very much to allow you to cover more suppliers and uncover more risk and be aware of it. But then secondly, to allow smaller companies to engage with this process as well. And that was further compounded by introductions in kind of regulations. So you had GDPR come in, which suddenly a lot of smaller firms that didn't realize they should be doing this process now had to, as well as some other kind of regulations in the insurance space and places. And reducing that cost again, so basically by reducing that cost and making things a lot more efficient, it then also as a byproduct leads to the programs being more effective. Because suddenly instead of looking at 10 suppliers every year, you're able to look at 100 and you're able actually to solve problems across 100 of your suppliers instead of just the 10. And then I found it a lot easier to justify back to the boards of the clients we were working with exactly what the program was doing and how well the program was doing it. So you're able to put out some kind of key KPIs around actions launched against suppliers, the number that have been closed out, and really start to justify kind of the increased focus and spend on the supply chain as well.
Ben, just before you speak, I just want to let the audience know. So if you have any questions for the panel, if you just drop them into the chat, I'll make sure the panel get a look at them. Sorry to jump in, Ben.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I was just a sort of further reflection on what Haydn was talking there about. One view I have got on this topic is that I do think there is an imbalance between the level of investment on third party and supply chain versus what an organization does on its own defences. And I sort of illustrate that. So whilst I'm absolutely behind Haydn, the cost point he's able to deliver through Risk Ledger, I also think organizations probably do need to invest more on a net level in what they're doing over supply chain. And an example, a conversation I was having just a few weeks ago with a CISO, and I'm going to simplify these numbers, but it illustrates a very sort of salient point. I think he had about a team of say 100 FTE, and he had $20 million budget, and he was investing in all sorts of tools, and he had some really challenging issues to fix for that organization. But then when I asked him sort of, where's the cost base for the group? Well, 60% is actually on third parties, and they had 1,000+ suppliers that he knew of. So 60% of their operations activities as a proxy are probably outside of his perimeter, and he had 2 people on third parties, and they were issuing questionnaires and collecting certificates, and that does feel really imbalanced from a risk management perspective. And I don't think that example is unique, and I think that's the thing that we probably should be really addressing as an approach to the topic.
That's absolutely true, but I would, as a counterpoint to that, I would say, where should that cost lie? Because I said right at the top, the third-party risk management program or tool, whatever you use, is there as a contractual catch, right? It's not there to actually perform any massive incident response type activity. It's there to make sure that you're putting the right things into contracts to cover yourselves if anything, in the event that anything does go wrong. So that doesn't feel like it's the information security return on investment. Particularly, it doesn't feel like you're going to get.
Well, I definitely have. I see third-party management as broader. I think that is a very valuable and important use case for the tool, but I don't think it's unique, and I don't think it's the only one. I mean,
it feels like it's one of those. It's almost like it's the CISO needs to go and lobby procurement and lobby legal and say, look, this is actually your problem. This is your risk, and I'm doing you a favour here. You need to be paying more for this. Certainly those are the conversations that I've been having. So
not only that, I think it's a lot easier to justify kind of spending that money on your supply chain when you actually have evidence that the programs are working.
Yeah, it definitely builds.
And CISOs who will quite openly say, yeah, we run this process just to tick the compliance box, and we don't think it really does reduce our kind of actual risk landscape. And whether or not you agree with that, if they hold that opinion or that view, it tends to be that the board will hold that, and then it's really hard to unlock that extra cash to spend. And so having some sort of metrics where you can actually show an improvement in the supply chain at scale, I think tends to then unlock that additional spend.
Absolutely right. As soon as you show a board that you're reducing risk, then they'll want to have more of it. Absolutely right. It's just you, as a CISO, you wouldn't want, or I wouldn't want, having been a CISO, I wouldn't want to bear that cost. You know, it's okay to spend a little bit of that cost, maybe 20% of the full cost, to show people how that risk can be managed better. But then I want to use that to bring everyone else in and say, look, procurement, look how easy this makes it for you. Go and buy some more licenses, go and automate it further. Look, legal, look how easy that makes it for you. You go and buy some more licenses. We'll all come to the party, we'll all play here. I'll start it off, you guys carry on. And actually, because you're going to need to operate it, all my guys do is, you know, log in and do their work and then log back out again. I don't want to be operating it.
Okay. Got a question for Ben and Rob. Have you ever seen a conversation where when a company's talking about outsourcing some sort of critical part of their business or moving an in-house service out to a supplier, have you ever seen an organization talk about the potential cost of running risk management exercises in that cost-saving conversation? Because that's something that I've never actually seen occur. You tend to find if we outsource this department, it's going to save us this amount of money, but then they don't really talk about actually it will lead to us needing to run this amount of work to consistently monitor and mitigate that risk. I thought that'd be quite an interesting kind of place to have that discussion.
Yeah, it tends to be done contractually again. So yeah, it's very much a one-time thing at the moment. So it's always one of those things where you're continually reviewing with the supplier and you have a list of metrics, but most of them, as you say, are operational metrics. Yeah. I have in the past again pushed security metrics into that and reviewed it directly with the suppliers or supplier managers. But that's security adding into an operational program, not a security driven program where you're getting live data. That'd be much more effective, much more interesting.
I think just a similar experience. I guess it's definitely a topic that's neglected. I think it's fair to say, and it's not thought about until after the event in many cases. So there might be something set up in the contract, but how well that is then subsequently executed varies hugely. On the flip side, I have seen some very good examples where those security controls are a key consideration. And they're defined quite explicitly in the contract. There's a whole governance regime set up, and then they are followed through quite rigorously. And I would say that tends to work even better where it is a big technology contract or where even security is part of the services being provided. That tends to naturally elevates or focuses people's attention. But it's definitely a bit of a weak point or a blind spot in lots of decision-making processes.
Excellent. So we are just 1 minute before the end of the time. So I just wanted to thank all three of you for giving your time to share those thoughts. There weren't any questions from the group. There's been some private messages for people who would like to follow up afterwards, so that's great. So thanks so much, guys. Thank you everyone who joined today. As we said, it was our first event. Few hiccups along the way, but I hope it was useful and insightful for you. And if you'd like to see some more of the Risk Ledger platform and how it could work to help you manage supply chain security risks, drop me an email on the email address on screen and I'll be happy to help.